The battlefield was still smoking when the shouting stopped. Cannon fire that had roared for hours faded into the distance, and the air hung thick with the acrid stench of powder, churned mud, and blood that had soaked deep into the earth. For the men in blue who had survived the slaughter, victory was not theirs, but neither was death. They were now prisoners, and the war, which they had thought they understood, was about to change into something far darker. Hands bound behind their backs, boots removed to prevent escape, they were herded like livestock from the field they had fought so hard to hold. Many were too weak to resist, stumbling over the bodies of friends and foes alike, driven forward, at bayonet point by grey-clad soldiers whose own faces betrayed exhaustion and bitterness. The wounded were given no mercy. Those who could not walk were left where they fell, and for many, a shallow grave under foreign soil was the final chapter of their service. In the first hours of capture, many Union soldiers still clung to the idea of honorable imprisonment. The laws of war, after all, dictated that captives were to be treated humanely, housed, fed, and returned when the fighting ended. Officers told them that they would be exchanged soon, that their ordeal would be brief, that they might even be home by Christmas. Some believed it. Others, watching Confederate guards spit on them or strip boots from dead bodies, were less certain. What none of them could know as they were marched southward, deeper into enemy territory, was how little those rules would matter once the Confederacy's own resources began to fail. The journey to captivity was often more deadly than the battles themselves. Prisoners were packed into rail cars meant for livestock, hundreds crammed together without water or ventilation. The summer heat in the deep south turned these rolling cages into ovens, and disease thrived in the filth. Men fainted from thirst, collapsed from dysentery, and suffocated against the press of bodies. Guards with fixed bayonets rode atop the cars, ready to shoot anyone who tried to escape, but few had the strength to even lift their heads. When the trains stopped, they were herded out for short marches, long columns of gaunt, dust-caked men trudging through towns where civilians jeered and threw stones. Once hailed as heroes by cheering crowds in the north, they were now paraded as trophies of Confederate victory. By the time the gates of Andersonville loomed into view, many had already lost any illusion of how they would be treated. The first sight of the place broke even the stubborn optimists. It was not a fortress or a barracks, as they had imagined, but a vast, open stockade of rough-hewn logs, a pen built not for soldiers, but for animals. The walls rose high, sharp stakes leaning inward to discourage climbing, with guard towers spaced along the perimeter. From above, armed sentries looked down at them with indifference, and beyond the walls they could hear the distant barking of dogs trained to hunt down escapees. Inside, the ground was churned into a swamp by thousands of feet. There were no tents, no shelters, no barracks. Men slept under scraps of canvas or dug shallow holes in the ground to crawl into at night. Food was a small handful of cornmeal and beans, often infested with weevils, and water was a trickle from a polluted stream that meandered through the center of the camp. It was here, standing in the filth and heat, that many finally understood the truth. They had not been captured to be exchanged, they had been captured to be forgotten. For some, the worst torment was not physical, but psychological. They had marched into battle believing they fought for a cause greater than themselves, for union, for liberty, for the preservation of a nation. Now they were stripped of weapons, rank and dignity, reduced to numbers on a ledger, waiting in a place where death was not an event, but a daily routine. Every man knew that no cavalry charge would come to rescue them, no daring raid would cut through the stockade walls. They were on their own, and in the merciless summer of 1864, in the heart of Georgia, that realization was enough to break even the strongest soldier's spirit. For many who crossed into Andersonville, the war ended the moment those gates closed behind them. The struggle now was not for victory or country, but for one more breath, one more day, And as the sun set over the crowded stockade and the moans of the sick rose into the humid air, the men who had once marched proudly under the stars and stripes understood that this was a different kind of battlefield, one where survival itself had become the only fight worth winning. When Confederate officials first chose a patch of pine forest in the rolling hills of southwestern Georgia for a new prison camp, they imagined it as a temporary solution to a temporary problem. The war had dragged on longer than anyone expected, and existing prisons in Richmond and other cities were overflowing with captured Union soldiers. Rail lines near Andersonville made it an ideal location for a new facility, and the isolated countryside meant fewer chances of escape. It was to be called Camp Sumter, and in the minds of its planners it would be a simple holding ground, a wooden stockade enclosing a few acres, designed to house no more than 10,000 men until prisoner exchanges resumed. But the war had long ceased to follow anyone's plans, and by the time the first trainloads of prisoners arrived in February 1864, the Confederate government was already losing control of the very system it had created. The construction itself was crude and hasty. Enslaved laborers and conscripted soldiers felled thousands of pine trees to build the walls, towering 15 feet high and sharpened to points at the top. The enclosure measured roughly 16 acres, and within it there was nothing but bare ground. No barracks, no huts, no cooking houses or hospitals were provided. The camp's commandant, Captain Heinrich Hartmann Wirtz, insisted that prisoners could build their own shelters from blankets or scrap wood, but few had either. The facility was never meant to last long enough for such measures to matter. Yet in a matter of weeks, the trickle of new arrivals became a flood. The breakdown of prisoner exchange agreements in 1863, particularly over the Confederacy's refusal to treat captured black Union soldiers as legitimate combatants, left tens of thousands of men languishing in captivity. By the spring of 1864, train after train brought more Union prisoners to Andersonville, far exceeding its original capacity. The stockade was hastily expanded by 10 acres, but even this proved woefully inadequate. By midsummer, more than 33,000 men were crammed into a space designed for less than a third of that number. Each prisoner's share of ground was barely enough to lie down without touching another man. When it rained, the ground dissolved into a foul, sucking mire. When the sun blazed, the earth baked into a cracked, suffocating dust. The infrastructure of the prison collapsed under the weight of its own neglect. There were no latrines or sewage systems, only shallow ditches that overflowed within days. Human waste soaked into the soil, breeding swarms of flies and mosquitoes that carried disease from man to man. The sole source of water was a small stream, Sweetwater Branch, that trickled through the center of the camp. Prisoners drank from it, washed in it, and defecated near it, and as the number of inmates soared, it became a poisonous brew of filth and bacteria. Dysentery, typhoid, and scurvy spread unchecked, and with no proper medical facilities, those who fell ill were left to rot on the ground. Food was just as scarce. The Confederacy itself was starving by 1864, its fields scorched, its railways sabotaged, and its supply lines stretched thin. What rations did reach Andersonville were pitiful: a small ration of coarse cornmeal, occasionally a scrap of bacon or peas. Malnutrition stripped the men of their strength, leaving them skeletal and hollow-eyed. Without fresh vegetables, scurvy ravaged their bodies, rotting gums and loosening teeth until even swallowing became agony. Some prisoners resorted to digging through the filth for stray grains of corn. Others traded the last of their possessions, a watch, a button, a scrap of uniform cloth, for a crust of bread from a guard. The prison's commandant defended the camp by pointing to the South's own desperate shortages, but the scale of suffering went beyond mere deprivation. Overcrowding turned even small wounds into death sentences. Men too weak to stand were trampled by those searching for space. Disease swept through the population with mathematical inevitability, and with every new arrival, the situation grew worse. Prisoners who entered Andersonville healthy often succumbed within weeks, their bodies unable to endure the filth, hunger, and exposure. By late summer, the camp had become a living graveyard. A city of the condemned sprawled beneath the open sky. At night, the groans of the sick and dying echoed against the stockade walls, a grim chorus that never stopped. There was no medicine, no sanitation, and no hope. What had been conceived as a temporary holding pen had transformed into one of the most infamous symbols of the Civil War, a place where thousands of men, once soldiers, now waited only for death. Andersonville had not been built to last, but its legacy would endure far longer than the war itself, carved into memory by the suffering of those who had no choice but to endure it. The men noticed it the moment they were marched into the stockade, a narrow strip of ground marked by a waist-high wooden rail that ran the entire perimeter of the camp, roughly 20 feet inside the towering log walls. It was nothing more than a crude fence, flimsy and unfinished in places, yet it commanded a presence that none dared challenge. Guards on the catwalks above had only one order regarding it. Any man who crossed the line, even by a single footstep, was to be shot without warning. They called it the deadline, and it quickly became more than a physical barrier. It was a boundary between misery and certain death. A psychological weapon designed to remind every prisoner just how powerless he truly was. At first, some men underestimated its importance. A few, desperate for shade or simply unaware of the rule, wandered too close. The crack of a rifle would ring out and another body would slump into the mud. Others tested it deliberately, hoping that perhaps the guards would show mercy or issue a warning. They never did. Within days of arriving, everyone inside Andersonville knew that the deadline was not an empty threat. It was absolute. Men spoke of it in whispers, pointing out the bloodstains near the rail where unlucky souls had fallen. Their names were rarely remembered. They became warnings rather than men. The space between the deadline and the wall was a barren strip, devoid of tents or debris. Nothing was ever left there because retrieving even a blanket blown by the wind meant risking a bullet. When storms swept through the camp and driving rain pushed flimsy shelters toward the forbidden zone, men clung to them with desperate strength, terrified they might be forced to choose between exposure and death. It wasn't uncommon to see a hungry man watch a piece of bread roll slowly toward the rail and simply let it go, knowing that reaching for it could be the last thing he ever did. The guards, often teenage boys or old men unfit for the front lines, took a grim pride in enforcing the rule. Many were underfed and resentful themselves, and shooting a prisoner offered a momentary illusion of control. Some even joked about it, calling the shots Andersonville promotions. Prisoners learned to fear not just the deadline itself, but the men behind the rifles, men who might fire out of boredom, hatred, or simply to break the monotony of guard duty. The unpredictability of it added another layer of terror. You could die for a misstep, for a stumble, for leaning too far toward the wall while trying to relieve yourself. The psychological toll was immense. Hunger and disease might weaken a man's body, but the deadline broke his spirit. It was a daily reminder that escape was not an option, that death was always just a step away, and that the guards held absolute power over life and death. The fence carved the camp into two worlds. One of the living, crowded and filthy, and one of the dead, silent and empty. Men would sit only a few feet from it, staring at the grass that grew untouched beyond, as if that thin strip of earth represented the freedom they once fought for. Some prisoners dreamed of charging it, of taking a bullet and ending their suffering. Quickly, For those racked by disease or consumed by despair, the deadline became an invitation, a final, easy way out of a life that no longer felt like living. Others found strength in refusing to let it claim them. They stayed well away from its reach, clinging to the belief that surviving one more day meant defying the system that sought to break them. In that way, the deadline served the Confederacy's purpose twice over. It not only prevented escape, but kept the prisoners in a state of constant psychological submission. By late 1864, stories of men shot for stepping across the line, or even for touching it, circulated through every corner of the camp. It was a shared language of fear, a reminder whispered into the ears of newcomers before they even laid down their meager possessions. The wooden rail itself weathered and splintered with time, but its meaning never changed. It was not just a fence, it was a boundary drawn through the human will. It reduced soldiers who had once charged into gunfire to men too frightened to reach for a scrap of cloth. It stripped them of agency before starvation could. And in the grim world of Andersonville, that was perhaps its most powerful and cruel achievement. By the spring rains of 1864, Andersonville had begun to dissolve into something more like a cesspit than a prison. The earth inside the walls, trampled by tens of thousands of bare and bootless feet, had lost all firmness. Each downpour turned the ground into a foul slurry, a stew of mud, human waste, rotting scraps of food, and the runoff from hundreds of makeshift shelters. The camp sat in a shallow basin, and water pooled in every low place. At dawn, when the mist lifted, the stockade seemed to steam with decay. A sour, fetid odor clung to everything, to the rags the men wore, to their skin, to the thin gruel they ate. It was the smell of thousands of bodies forced to live, sicken and die in one confined space. There were no latrines to speak of, no proper drainage, no system for removing waste. Men relieved themselves where they slept, and when the rains came, it all washed together into rivulets that snaked toward the central stream, Sweet Water Branch. The camp's only source of drinking water was by now anything but sweet. It carried filth from one side of the stockade to the other, a slow-moving ribbon of infection that men still cupped their hands into because thirst left them no choice. Some tried digging shallow wells, but most collapsed inward or filled with the same polluted runoff. There was nowhere to escape it. Every breath tasted faintly of rot, every sip of water threatened to kill. The filth brought with it an army of uninvited companions. Flies swarmed in black clouds around the piles of waste and the sores of the dying. Rats the size of cats darted between shelters, bold enough to gnaw on sleeping men. Lice infested every rag of clothing, burrowing into seams and biting until the skin was raw. Even the dying were not spared. Rats would sometimes feed on the corpses before burial details arrived. Men tried to chase them off, but hunger often left them too weak to move. The vermin were not just nuisances, they were carriers. Fleas and lice spread typhus, flies carried bacteria from open sores to food, rats brought fevers and infected wounds. Disease thrived in every filthy corner. Dysentery was the most common killer. It swept through the camp like fire through dry timber. Men doubled over in agony, dehydrated and delirious, their bodies racked with violent cramps. They wasted away in days, leaving behind nothing but skin and bone. The ground where they lay was soaked in their fluids, and still more men came to rest there as space grew scarce. Scurvy, too, took a terrible toll. Without any fresh vegetables or citrus, bodies began to betray themselves. Gums bled, teeth loosened, old wounds refused to heal. Men who had once been strong enough to march for days could no longer stand without help. Gangrene followed in the wake of even the smallest injury. A scratch from a rat's claw, a blister from a crude shoe, a splinter from a shelter pole could become an open wound that blackened and festered until amputation, impossible without tools or medicine, was the only chance of survival. The so-called hospital section was little more than a patch of ground marked off from the rest of the air camp, and it was often worse than the general population. The sick and dying lay shoulder to shoulder in the mud, their cries mingling with the drone of insects. There were no bandages, no antiseptics, no doctors beyond a handful of captured Union surgeons working with whatever they could scavenge. They boiled rags for dressings and carved rotting flesh with knives meant for cutting meat. Even their efforts were often in vain. Most patients did not leave the hospital alive. As the weeks turned into months, disease claimed hundreds every week, then every day. The burial details worked constantly, carrying bodies on makeshift stretchers to shallow graves beyond the stockade walls. Sometimes there were so many dead that they were left piled near the gates overnight, waiting for space to be dug. New arrivals from the front could see the rows of corpses before they even stepped inside, a grim preview of their likely fate. In the end, it was not bullets or bayonets that did the most damage to the men of Andersonville. It was filth, relentless, inescapable, and merciless. It seeped into every cut, every sip of water, every breath. It consumed men slowly, hollowing them out from within, stripping them of strength and will, long before it took their lives. And as the camp population grew and conditions worsened, the filth did what the guards' rifles could not. It broke them down completely, body and soul, until they were no longer soldiers or prisoners, but merely survivors, clinging to life. In a swamp that had once been a patch of pine forest and was now a monument to human suffering. It was just a trickle when they first saw it. A narrow stream winding lazily through the center of the camp, its clear surface reflecting the harsh Georgia sun. Sweet Water Branch, the guards called it, as if its name could disguise what it truly was. For the tens of thousands trapped inside Andersonville's walls, it was the only source of water, for drinking, for cooking, for washing, for everything that sustained or degraded life. Men staggered toward it on their first day in the stockade, cupping their hands and gulping down its cool current, as if it were a gift from heaven. Within weeks, that gift had turned into something far more sinister. The prison's population swelled, and the stream's fate was sealed. There was no system to separate waste from water, no sanitation plan, no designated bathing area. Everything flowed into the same sluggish current. Men bathed their sores upstream while others, too, weak to crawl to the far end, defecated a few feet away. Laundry was scrubbed beside the same spot where bodies were dragged to rinse off before burial. By midsummer, the water was no longer clear but cloudy and brown, its surface coated in a greasy sheen from human filth and decay. It smelled foul, sour, and sickly, but still men bent to drink from it, because thirst was stronger than disgust. Those who hesitated often paid a price for their caution. The Georgia sun was merciless, baking the stockade into an oven and leaching water from the body faster than any man could endure. Rations, a handful of cornmeal and the occasional scrap of meat, offered little moisture. Without the creek, dehydration would kill them within days. So they crawled to its banks and swallowed disease by the mouthful, knowing the risk and hating themselves for it. Dysentery spread like a curse, racking bodies with unstoppable waves of cramping and diarrhea that only deepened the contamination. Typhoid followed close behind, and soon the stream was not a lifeline, but a conveyor of death. Each day, the burial details came to the creek's edge to collect the dead. Some were found face down in the water, having collapsed mid-drink. Others lay nearby, too weak to crawl back to their shelters. Their bodies were dragged away by the ankles, leaving grooves in the muddy bank. The cycle was unrelenting. Water caused sickness, sickness caused death, and death polluted the water even further. No one knew how many had perished directly because of Sweetwater Branch, but few doubted it claimed more lives than the guards' rifles. Prisoners tried everything to make the water safe. Some strained it through rags or shirts, hoping to catch the worst of the filth. Others dug shallow pits in the ground to let the water seep in slowly, believing that the soil might cleanse it. These attempts did little good. The bacteria were invisible, unstoppable, and indifferent to their desperate efforts. Even boiling was nearly impossible, fuel was scarce, and few men had anything resembling a pot. Most resigned themselves to the inevitable, swallowing their fear with each gulp. There were stories of men who refused to drink altogether, choosing death by thirst over the slow agony of disease. They rarely lasted more than a few days. Others clung to hope that the Confederates might build a proper well or bring water from outside, but none came. The guards themselves had a separate supply and avoided the creek entirely, an unspoken acknowledgement of the horror below. Their indifference deepened the prisoners' despair. It was as if the contaminated stream were part of the punishment, a slow and invisible weapon designed to break them down without a single shot fired. By late summer, the creek had become the camp's most hated feature and its most indispensable one. Men cursed it even as they crawled toward it. They spat insults at it even as they drank from its poisoned flow. It was the cruelest of paradoxes, the one thing they could not live without was also the thing most likely to kill them. And in that truth lay the essence of Andersonville itself, a place where survival was measured not by strength or bravery, but by how long a man could endure what should have been unendurable. When the rains came, the water rose, briefly diluting the filth and giving false hope that conditions might improve, but the respite was always temporary. As the skies cleared and the camp filled again with human waste and the refuse of death, the creek returned to its deadly state. It continued to flow long after the war ended, but for the men who drank from it, Sweetwater Branch was not a memory of relief. It was a scar, a reminder of how thirst could strip away dignity, how desperation could make poison taste like salvation, and how even a simple stream could become an accomplice to suffering on a scale the human mind struggled to comprehend. Hunger was the one enemy that no man in Andersonville could escape. It arrived quietly at first, a gnawing emptiness in the gut that soldiers hardened by long campaigns knew how to ignore. But as the weeks stretched into months and the rations grew smaller and more pitiful, that emptiness deepened into something far more dangerous, a slow, relentless erasure of the body and mind. The Confederate supply system was collapsing under the weight of a war it could no longer sustain. Union blockades strangled southern ports, scorched earth tactics destroyed fields and railroads, and what little food remained was reserved for the troops still fighting at the front. For the men behind the stockade walls, forgotten and powerless, there was almost nothing left. Each prisoner received a daily ration that was supposed to sustain life but barely postponed death. A handful of coarse cornmeal, often crawling with weevils, and a scrap of meat that was more fat and gristle than nourishment were all that most could expect. Sometimes the meat was so rancid that the smell alone turned stomachs. Yet men choked it down anyway, desperate for anything to fill the void. On other days, there was no meat at all, just a small square of bread so hard it could shatter against a stone, or a ladle of thin bean soup that offered more water than sustenance. It was not enough to keep a man strong. It was not even enough to keep him alive. Within weeks, the signs of starvation were everywhere. Faces once full and weathered from battle became hollow and sunken, cheekbones cutting sharp lines beneath parchment skin. Eyes that had once burned with defiance dulled and retreated into deep sockets. Ribs jutted out like the frame of a ship stripped of its planks. Uniforms hung loose and shapeless, and belts were cinched tighter and tighter until there was nothing left to tighten. Men who had marched 20 miles a day now struggled to crawl a few feet. Some could no longer rise from the ground at all, lying motionless in the mud and filth, too weak even to swat away the flies that crawled across their faces. Hunger did more than destroy the body. It ate away at the spirit. Conversations that once revolved around home battles and escape now centered on food, on memories of meals long past, on imagined feasts that would never come. Men spoke obsessively about bread, about butter, about roasted meat and steaming coffee. They licked empty tin cups just to catch the faintest trace of flavor. They fought over scraps dropped in the dirt. Theft, once considered unthinkable among comrades, became common. A man's entire world shrank to the next bite, and morality often disappeared with the muscle and fat. Some prisoners tried to survive by bartering what little they had. A coat might fetch a crust of bread, a button might buy a sip of soup. Others scavenged in the filth for anything remotely edible, chewed leather, bones gnawed clean by rats, weeds growing near the deadline. There were even whispers, never spoken too loudly, of men eating the flesh of the dead. Whether those stories were true or the fevered hallucinations of the starving, they reflected a reality where humanity was slipping away grain by grain. Disease and hunger worked hand in hand, each feeding the other. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making men easy prey for dysentery, scurvy, and typhoid. Those illnesses, in turn, robbed them of what little nourishment they could take in. Teeth loosened and fell out, tongues swelled, gums bled constantly. Wounds refused to heal. Even a small cut could fester into a death sentence. The line between the living and the dying blurred as skeletal figures shuffled past one another, indistinguishable in their suffering. The guards, watching from their posts, saw the transformation and did nothing. They too were suffering shortages, but their misery was never as absolute as what unfolded inside the stockade. Confederate officials claimed that they lacked the resources to feed their prisoners, but many of the captives knew the truth. They were low on the list of priorities, and their starvation was as much neglect as necessity. By late 1864, most men inside Andersonville had lost a third, often half, of their body weight. Many no longer resembled soldiers at all. They were husks, shadows of the men who had once marched proudly beneath the Union flag, now crawling through the mud in search of crumbs. Some simply wasted away where they lay, their bodies consuming themselves until there was nothing left. Others drifted into delirium, speaking to people who were not there, reaching for meals that existed only in their minds. Hunger did not kill quickly, like a bullet or a bayonet. It killed slowly, deliberately, stripping a man of strength, dignity, memory, and finally breath. And in that slowness lay its cruelty. There was no moment of decisive struggle, no final act of defiance, only the long, silent fading of thousands, of men into nothingness. By the time the war ended, many who survived would carry the marks of starvation for the rest of their lives, their bodies and souls forever shaped by the days they spent wasting away behind the walls of Andersonville. The cruelty of Andersonville did not come only from the guards in gray or the orders from Richmond. Some of the worst suffering came from within the walls themselves. Hunger, thirst, and despair stripped away the veneer of discipline and comradeship that once bound Union soldiers together. In the absence of law, a new order emerged, one built not on duty or brotherhood, but on brute strength and ruthless opportunism. It began with small thefts, desperate men snatching crumbs of bread or bits of cloth from the weak. But as the camp population swelled and starvation deepened, that desperation hardened into something organized and far more dangerous. They called themselves the Raiders, and they were Union soldiers too, or at least they had been once. Now they were predators, a loose confederation of thieves and killers who ruled entire sections of the stockade through fear. At first they operated under the cover of darkness, slipping into shelters and cutting straps from sleeping men's haversacks. But soon they grew bolder. They moved in gangs, surrounding their victims in broad daylight and beating them senseless before stripping them of whatever possessions they still had. A blanket, a spoon, a crust of bread. Anything could make a man a target. The raiders were not just thieves, they were a system. They had leaders, lieutenants, and muscle. They parceled out territories and demanded tribute from weaker prisoners. Those who resisted were beaten, sometimes to death, their bodies left in the mud as a warning. The guards did nothing to stop them. To the Confederates, the violence served a purpose. It kept the prisoners divided, turned them against one another, and made them easier to control. A fractured camp would never organize an escape or resist authority. For the ordinary prisoner, life became a constant balance between two dangers: the slow death of hunger and disease, and the swift brutality of the raiders. Men built crude weapons. Clubs carved from a firewood sharpened scraps of metal, not to fight the guards, but to defend themselves from their own countrymen. New arrivals, still clinging to ideals of military discipline and brotherhood, quickly learned that the enemy within could be deadlier than the one beyond the walls. The breaking point came in the summer of 1864. The violence had grown intolerable. Prisoners were murdered over handfuls of meal. Entire shelters were burned by the raiders in displays of dominance. Rumors spread that they were plotting to seize control of food distribution entirely. Desperation turned into resolve, and for the first time, the powerless decided to fight back. A group of determined prisoners, many of them veterans and natural leaders, began to organize a resistance. They called themselves the Regulators. Their mission was simple: bring order to the chaos, even if it meant killing their fellow prisoners. To do it, the confrontation that followed was swift and brutal. Armed with clubs and whatever scraps of metal they could find, the Regulators launched coordinated raids on the raiders' strongholds within the camp. Fights broke out in the mud, and men who had once served side by side in the same regiments now swung weapons at one another with feral rage. Some of the raiders were beaten nearly to death before they were captured. Others tried to flee, but found nowhere to go. There was no escape from the stockade, and no refuge from justice. Once the raiders were subdued, the Regulators did something extraordinary. They held trials. Witnesses were called, accusations made, and verdicts rendered, all within the confines of the prison walls. It was a desperate imitation of the justice that had vanished from their lives. A reminder that even in a place designed to erase humanity, men still sought order and accountability. The most violent of the raiders, 6 of them, were sentenced to death. With the approval of Captain Wirtz, they were hanged before a crowd of thousands. The rest were flogged, beaten, or banished to the outskirts of the camp. For a brief moment, the stockade felt different. The violence lessened. The weak could sleep without fear of being robbed in the night. But the victory was a hollow one. The food was still scarce, the water still poison, and death still stalked every corner. The Regulators had not saved the prisoners from their suffering. They had merely removed one layer of it. Yet in that bloody uprising lay a small, stubborn truth. Even in the depths of despair, even when stripped of everything, men still clung to the idea of justice, and sometimes they were willing to fight and die for it. The memory of the raiders lingered long after they were gone. They were a reminder of what starvation and hopelessness could do to a man, how easily soldiers could become predators when the thin fabric of civilization tore apart. But they were also a testament to the resilience of those who refused to surrender, to that darkness. Men who, even in a place as hopeless as Andersonville, still believed that there was a line between survival and savagery. There was no hospital in Andersonville in any meaningful sense of the word. There were no rows of clean cots, no white-coated surgeons, no shelves lined with medicines. There was only a patch of trampled earth set aside from the rest of the camp, a place where the sick and dying lay in heaps beneath the open sky. Flies buzzed constantly over their bodies, drawn to the oozing sores and infected wounds that no one had the means to treat. The smell was overwhelming, a rancid mix of sweat, blood, pus, and decay, and yet men crawled there by the hundreds because they had nowhere else to go. The Confederate authorities offered almost nothing in the way of medical care. Their own hospitals were stretched beyond capacity, and there were no supplies to spare for prisoners. Most guards viewed the sick as already dead and saw little reason to waste effort on them. If a man was too weak to stand, he was left to lie where he fell. If he was too sick to eat, he starved. And if disease took him, his body was hauled away at dawn like so much refuse. Yet within this landscape of neglect, small pockets of resistance formed. Among the prisoners were trained physicians, surgeons and medics who had once served in Union field hospitals, and they refused to do nothing. These men, stripped of their instruments and supplies, became inventors as much as doctors. They crafted scalpels from sharpened scraps of metal, scavenged from ration tins. They boiled strips of old clothing to make crude bandages. They pounded herbs and leaves from the sparse vegetation around the stockade into pastes they hoped would draw out infection. Mud was used to cool fevered brows, while ash and charcoal were pressed into wounds to stop bleeding. They worked with whatever they had, improvising remedies that in any other context would have been laughable. In Andersonville, they were all that stood between life and certain death. The most desperate operations were amputations. Gangrene was rampant, spreading swiftly through untreated wounds, and without intervention, it was almost always fatal. Lacking proper tools, the prisoner surgeons used pocket knives or saw blades pried from broken equipment. A heated bayonet or iron rod served as a cautery to seal blood vessels and prevent infection. There was no anesthesia beyond a piece of wood to bite down on, and a prayer that unconsciousness would come quickly. Many men died on the ground before the crude surgery was over. Others survived, their stumps wrapped in rags, their lives extended. But forever changed. Despite their efforts, death remained an unrelenting presence. Dysentery, typhoid, and scurvy tore through the camp, and no amount of improvised medicine could stop them. Men wasted away as their bodies failed to absorb nutrients. Their eyes yellowed, their skin broke out in sores, and their organs shut down one by one. The so-called hospital became a place of waiting rather than healing. Each morning the living and the dead lay side by side until burial details came to drag away the corpses, often stepping over the still breathing as they did. Yet amid this horror, stories circulated of men who survived against all odds. A soldier, whose arm had turned black from infection, walked again after an amputation performed with nothing more than a dull blade and a strip of leather for restraint. Another man, delirious with fever and given up for dead, was nursed back to life by a fellow prisoner who fed him drops of muddy water and pressed damp cloths to his skin day after day until the fever finally broke. These stories spread through the camp like whispers of hope, reminders that not all battles were lost, even here. The prisoner doctors themselves were often in worse condition than their patients. They labored with trembling hands, weakened by hunger and disease, pushing their bodies beyond exhaustion to save lives that most would have written off. They had no medicines, no antiseptics, no instruments worthy of the name. What they had was knowledge, determination, and a stubborn refusal to surrender to the indifference that surrounded them. It was not enough to save everyone. It was not enough to save most. But it was enough to save some, and in Andersonville that was a victory. By the late summer of 1864, the camp's hospital was nothing more than a patchwork of misery, but it stood as a testament to the resilience of the human will. Men who had lost everything, their freedom, their strength, their dignity, still fought to keep one another alive. They stitched, cut, bandaged, and prayed, knowing that death would claim most of their patience anyway. And yet they did it because to do nothing was to accept the total collapse of their humanity. In a place designed to erase that humanity entirely, every improvised operation and every whispered word of comfort was an act of quiet defiance. It was proof that even in a landscape of suffering and death, compassion could still take root. Beyond the towering log walls of Andersonville, just over the rise, where the smell of decay still drifted on the humid Georgia air, stretched a landscape that told the true story of the prison. It was a rolling field of earth carved into rows, long, uneven scars dug hastily into the red clay. Here, far from the noise and chaos of the stockade, lay the silent dead. They arrived one by one at first, carried out on makeshift stretchers built from sticks and rags, their bodies wrapped in blankets if they were lucky, or left exposed to the elements if they were not. But as the weeks turned into months and the death toll rose without pause, they began to arrive in groups. The daily burial details became as routine as the meager rations or the sound of gunshots from the guard towers. By the height of summer 1864, death had become as much a part of Andersonville's rhythm as the rising and setting of the sun. Nearly 100 men died each day from starvation, disease, exposure, or the wounds inflicted by their fellow prisoners. The living grew accustomed to waking beside corpses, their bodies cold and stiff in the morning light. Some men died so quietly that their neighbors did not realize until they reached out to shake them awake. Others raved in fever and delirium, crying out for wives, mothers, or comrades who would never hear their last words. Once a man stopped breathing, there was no ceremony, no time for mourning. His body was stripped of anything useful, a button, a scrap of cloth, a shoe, and then carried beyond the wall to join the thousands already buried there. The burial crews were prisoners too, chosen for their strength or simply unlucky enough to be assigned the duty. They dug trenches under the relentless sun, each one barely wide enough to hold the rows of bodies they piled into them. The graves were shallow, often just deep enough to keep scavenging animals away, and the soil was so dry and hard that shovels struck sparks against buried stones. In the early days, each man received a separate grave marked by a simple wooden headboard carved with his name, regiment, and home state. As the death toll mounted, even that small dignity became rare. Many were buried unnamed, their identities lost with the rags that once served as uniforms, their stories forgotten before the earth closed over them. Still, there were those among the prisoners who refused to let their comrades vanish entirely. Some carved names and messages into the crude markers with pocket knives, while others tore scraps of cloth from their own clothing to serve as makeshift flags. A few wrote down the names of the dead on scraps of paper or bits of wood, hoping someone would find them after the war. It was a way to fight back against the anonymity of mass death, a final act of brotherhood in a place that had done everything to strip it away. The graveyard grew larger with each passing day. Fresh mounds of earth appeared in long, uneven rows, stretching farther from the stockade until the burial parties had to march for half an hour to reach open ground. Rain washed the soil from the newer graves, exposing bones before they could settle. Wooden markers rotted in the heat and rain, their inscriptions fading until nothing remained but splintered wood and bare earth. By the end of the war, more than 13,000 Union soldiers would lie in Andersonville's soil, their resting place forming one of the largest Union cemeteries in the South. To those still inside the prison, the graveyard was more than a place of death. It was a constant, living presence. Men could see the burial details through gaps in the stockade, trudging into the distance with their grim loads. They could smell the sour odor of freshly turned earth after a rainstorm. They knew that beyond those walls lay the final destination that awaited most of them. It was a thought that hovered over every moment, shaping how they spoke, how they prayed, how they clung to life. And yet, In that field of nameless graves and faded markers, there was also a trace of something enduring. The men buried there were not forgotten by those who lived alongside them. They were spoken of in hushed voices, their stories shared around dying campfires, their names scratched into the dirt by trembling hands. They were brothers, comrades, countrymen, soldiers who had endured unimaginable suffering and met death. Not on a battlefield, but in a place that should never have existed. Long after the guns of the Civil War fell silent, their graves would remain as witnesses, and in the quiet beyond the wall, where the wind rustled through grass and the soil, held the memory of so much pain. The story of Andersonville was written, not in ink or stone, but in the bones of the men who never came home. The world beyond Andersonville's towering walls might as well have been a different planet. Inside, men lay dying in the mud, their bodies wasted to skeletons, their eyes hollow and unseeing. Outside, life went on. Battles raged, politicians debated, families waited for letters that never came. The suffering of tens of thousands of Union soldiers remained hidden behind layers of silence, denial, and deliberate neglect. Even those who suspected that conditions in Confederate prisons were harsh could not imagine the scale of the misery festering in that patch of Georgia soil. For many prisoners, the only connection to the world they had left behind was the hope of a letter. They scratched out messages on scraps of paper, writing with charcoal or ink made from soot and water, telling their families they were alive, asking for news, praying for rescue. Most of those letters never reached their destination. Confederate officials strictly censored prisoner correspondence, removing anything that described the conditions of the camp. Words like starving, disease, or death were blotted out, or the entire letter was confiscated. Even the most desperate pleas for help were often destroyed before they left the stockade. The men's voices were silenced before they ever had a chance to reach the North. The Confederacy itself worked hard to control the narrative. Officials in Richmond insisted that Union prisoners were treated according to the accepted rules of war, that any shortages they suffered were the result of the South's own privations under blockade and invasion. Reports that filtered through to newspapers in the North were vague and often dismissed as exaggerations or enemy propaganda. Some accounts described harsh conditions and high mortality rates, but without first-hand testimony or photographs, they were easy to doubt. And so the truth, the filth, the starvation, the daily parade of corpses remained largely invisible to the public. Even in Washington, the reality was poorly understood. Military officials knew that prisoner exchanges had broken down, but few realized how catastrophic the situation had become. Before 1863, captured soldiers were often exchanged under the Dix Hill Cartel, a system that allowed both sides to repatriate prisoners relatively quickly. That system collapsed when the Confederacy refused to treat captured black Union soldiers as legitimate combatants, threatening to sell them into slavery or execute them outright. The Union responded by halting all exchanges until the Confederates recognized black troops as soldiers. It was a moral stand, one President Lincoln refused to compromise, but it came at a devastating cost for those languishing in Southern prisons. Month after month, the negotiations stalled. Confederate authorities demanded a return to the old system without addressing the status of black soldiers. Union leaders insisted on equal treatment, and while diplomats and generals argued over terms and principles, the men in Andersonville died by the hundreds. They were the collateral damage of a larger political struggle, their suffering unseen and their sacrifices unacknowledged. A few rumors did escape the prison, carried by escaped prisoners or exchanged officers. They spoke of horrific conditions, of starvation and disease, of men dying faster than they could be buried, but without corroborating evidence, their stories were often met with skepticism. How could thousands of men be allowed to waste away without anyone intervening? How could the United States Army, with all its power and resources, fail to save its own soldiers? The idea was too monstrous for many to believe. Meanwhile, Southern newspapers published carefully worded stories portraying Union prisoners as well-fed and healthy, even suggesting that they were better off than Confederate soldiers in the field. Sketches and descriptions painted a picture of orderly camps and humane treatment, designed to placate critics abroad and reassure sympathizers at home. The reality of men drinking water laced with excrement, of bodies stacked for burial by the dozens, of starvation so severe that men ate rats and weeds, was nowhere to be found. By the end of 1864, Andersonville had become a place that existed almost entirely outside the consciousness of the world. For those inside, it was the whole universe, a place where time blurred, where seasons were marked not by calendars, but by waves of disease and death. For those outside, it was a rumor, a footnote, a distant concern overshadowed by the march of armies and the politics of emancipation. Only after the war, when photographs of the survivors, skeletal, hollow-eyed and barely clinging to life, began to circulate, did the full horror come into view. But during those long months of captivity, the silence was total. No newspapers carried their cries. No speeches in Congress mentioned their names. Families waited by windows for letters that would never arrive. And inside the walls, the men who were dying by the hundreds each week knew the bitter truth. They were not just prisoners of the Confederacy. They were prisoners of a larger indifference. Forgotten by those with the power to save them, they faded from the world one by one, leaving behind only the shallow graves beyond the stockade and the terrible silence that had allowed it all to happen. Hope was a dangerous thing inside Andersonville. It could keep a man alive when his body had no strength left, but it could also destroy him more completely than hunger or disease ever could. By the summer of 1864, with death claiming hundreds, each week hope became a currency, traded more fiercely than bread or water. It arrived not in letters or official announcements, but in whispers. Rumors passed from man to man in the darkness, stories of prisoner exchanges about to resume, of trains being prepared, of orders signed and sealed in distant capitals. Each tale had its own details, its own imagined timeline, but they all promised the same thing: freedom was coming. Those whispers moved faster than disease. A man too weak to crawl one day would rise and try to stand the next, clinging to the belief that if he could survive just a few more days, just long enough for the exchange to begin, he might yet see his home again. Men counted days and weeks by the latest gossip, marking time with imaginary deadlines. When those days passed without change, they simply moved the goalpost further. Maybe it was delayed by rain. Maybe a general had fallen ill. Maybe the Confederates were preparing the paperwork. The stories twisted and stretched to keep hope alive, because the alternative, accepting that no one was coming, was unbearable. The Confederate guards, perhaps sensing the power that hope held, sometimes fueled the rumors themselves. A sympathetic sentry might mention hearing that Washington had agreed to new terms. A passing officer might hint that trains were being readied in nearby Macon. None of it was ever confirmed, but none of it was entirely denied either. Hope, after all, was a useful tool. It kept the prisoners docile, less likely to riot or attempt desperate escapes. It bought time for a Confederacy that had nothing left to give. Weeks became months, and still the exchanges did not come. Men who had survived battles at Shiloh and Gettysburg, who had endured the tortures of starvation and disease, began to lose their grip on reality. They dreamed of walking through their front doors, of wives waiting on porches, of children running to meet them. Some even swore they could smell the bread baking in their kitchens or feel the breeze of their hometown streets. When another week passed and they were still trapped behind the stockade walls, the disappointment crushed them. Men who had fought to survive for months simply lay down and stopped eating. Others wandered the camp aimlessly, their eyes empty, their minds broken by the betrayal of hope. And yet in time, some of those rumors proved true. In the winter of 1864 and into 1865, as the Confederacy's grip on the war slipped away, limited exchanges did resume. Prisoners were paroled and sent north by rail and steamboat, but by then, for many, the damage was irreversible. They left Andersonville so skeletal and frail that they had to be carried onto the trains. Their uniforms hung from their frames, like rags on a scarecrow. Their skin clung tightly to bone, and their hair fell out in clumps. When they arrived at Union hospitals, doctors struggled to believe they were soldiers at all. Some wept when they caught sight of the stars and stripes. Again, others could not speak, their voices reduced to faint rasps by months of malnutrition. Many died before they could be reunited with their families, their bodies simply too ravaged to recover. They had clung to life with a ferocity that defied logic, but freedom had come too late for their bodies to make use of it. In some cases, they survived only a few days, long enough to dictate a final letter home or feel the warmth of a familiar hand before slipping away. For those who did recover, life after Andersonville was marked by scars that never truly healed. They bore the physical consequences: chronic illness, permanent disability, digestive systems ruined beyond repair. But the psychological wounds were often worse. They woke from nightmares believing they were still behind the stockade walls. The sound of running water reminded them of the poisoned creek. The smell of bread brought back memories of starvation so severe that it hurt to chew. Inside Andersonville, hope had been the last weapon left to the dying. It was the reason men rose each morning and the reason they endured one more night. But it was also a cruel trick, a promise that came too late for thousands who might have been saved if it had arrived weeks or even days earlier. When the gates finally opened and the survivors staggered into the sunlight, they left behind not only the bodies of their fallen comrades, but the pieces of themselves that hope had broken. And in the long, painful years that followed, they carried with them the bitter knowledge that the thing that had kept them alive had also, in the end, been the thing that destroyed them. By the winter of 1864, the war that had once seemed endless was drawing to its inevitable conclusion. The Confederate States, once confident of independence, were crumbling from within. Railroads lay in ruins, supply depots burned, and entire regions were stripped bare by Union armies sweeping across the South. Nowhere was the collapse felt more brutally than within the stockade at Andersonville. The men imprisoned there had been abandoned long before the Confederacy itself began to die, but as its power disintegrated, their suffering entered a final, desperate phase. The first sign of change came not with a shout or a volley of gunfire, but with a strange silence. The guards who once patrolled the catwalks with rifles at the ready were fewer each day. Some slipped away under cover of darkness, deserting to return to their families as Union armies drew closer. Others were conscripted into hastily formed militia units, pulled from the prison to defend collapsing lines elsewhere in Georgia. The remaining sentries were older men, boys, or those too ill to fight, thin and hollow-eyed, barely distinguishable from the prisoners they watched. The once menacing authority of the camp dissolved into neglect. As Sherman's armies cut a swath through Georgia on their infamous march to the sea, Confederate supply lines were severed beyond repair. The rations that had once been meager now became almost non-existent. Days passed without food deliveries. The thin handfuls of cornmeal sometimes failed to appear at all, and the scraps of meat, already foul and rancid, vanished entirely. Prisoners scavenged through the mud for anything remotely edible: roots, insects, scraps of leather. They chewed on wood shavings to fool their bodies into believing they were eating. Starvation, which had once killed slowly, now accelerated into a merciless culling. Disease, too, intensified in the vacuum of care. Without guards to enforce even minimal order, sanitation collapsed further. Waste overflowed into every corner of the camp, and the creek, long a channel of death, became a stagnant, poisonous stream. Dysentery, scurvy, and typhoid claimed. Hundreds each week. The makeshift hospital, already little more than a graveyard in waiting, became a place of silent despair. Men lay shoulder to shoulder in the mud, too weak to lift their heads, their eyes fixed on nothing. The few prisoner doctors still alive could do nothing but watch them fade. News of Sherman's advance filtered into the camp as rumors at first, whispers of burning cities, of Confederate armies scattering, of Union flags raised over once secure strongholds. The stories seemed too good to believe. After months of false hopes and broken promises, many prisoners refused to trust them. Yet, as the sounds of distant artillery grew louder and columns of smoke appeared on the horizon, even the most cynical among them knew the end was near. When the first Union scouts finally reached the outskirts of Andersonville in the spring of 1865, they found a place that hardly seemed part of the same war they had been fighting. The men inside the stockade were no longer soldiers in any recognizable sense. They were specters, skeletal, hollow-cheeked, and barely clothed. Some crawled to the gates, too weak to stand, but unwilling to wait any longer for liberation. Others stared silently, their minds so broken by suffering that they could not comprehend what freedom meant. The Confederate guards who remained offered no resistance. Many simply laid down their arms and surrendered, relieved that the ordeal was over. A few even wept when Union officers arrived, overcome by guilt or shame for what had happened under their watch. But there was no triumph in the liberation of Andersonville, no cheers or songs of victory. It was too late for the 13,000 already buried beyond the walls. It was too late for the thousands more who would die in the coming days and weeks, their bodies too damaged by starvation and disease to recover. The Union troops who entered the camp were horrified. Hardened soldiers who had marched through battlefields, strewn with the dead and dying, stood speechless before the living corpses that greeted them. Many wept openly, while others cursed in fury at the cruelty that had allowed such suffering to exist. They did what they could, distributing food, tending to wounds, organizing medical evacuations, but it was a losing battle. For many of the prisoners, liberation was simply the final chapter in a long, slow death. The fall of the Confederacy brought an end to the institution that had created Andersonville, but it could not undo the horrors committed there. The stockade remained as it was, a scar on the land and a monument to human cruelty. In the months that followed, investigators would document its crimes, and its commandant would stand trial. Yet none of that could erase the memory of those final, starving days when an entire army's defeat played out not in glorious battles, but in the silent suffering of forgotten men. The war ended, but for thousands who never left Andersonville alive, peace had come far too late. When the war finally ended, and the gates of Andersonville swung open for the last time, the few who stumbled out were not the soldiers they had once been. They were emaciated, hollow-eyed survivors, barely recognizable as human beings, their bones pressing against skin, stretched thin as paper. Yet they carried with them something far more powerful than their broken bodies: the truth. It was a truth that could not be denied or explained away, a truth written in diaries, etched into drawings, and spoken through trembling lips. When that truth reached the North, it shocked a nation that had believed it had already seen the worst the Civil War had to offer. The first stories came from men too weak to walk on their own. They were carried into Union hospitals on stretchers, many weighing less than 100 pounds. Doctors and nurses recoiled at the sight of them. Their hair had fallen out in clumps. Their gums bled constantly. Their skin was covered in sores. Some could barely speak, their voices rasping out broken accounts between gasps for breath. But they spoke nonetheless about the filth, the starvation, the relentless death that had surrounded them. They spoke of drinking water fouled by human waste, of eating rats and weeds to stay alive, of watching friends collapse mid-sentence and never rise again. Diaries smuggled out during captivity soon surfaced, written in pencil on scraps of paper, or pages torn from ration books. They chronicled the daily reality of life inside the stockade in heartbreaking detail. The pitiful rations, the diseases that swept through the camp unchecked, the stench of death that hung over everything. One entry described men so weak they had to crawl to the creek for water, dragging themselves through the mud like animals. Another told of prisoners who had lost the strength to dig graves, leaving bodies to rot where they fell. These first-hand accounts stripped away any remaining illusions about the conditions Confederate officials had long dismissed as unavoidable hardships. Artists among the survivors offered another kind of testimony. Using charcoal, pencil, or whatever materials they could find, they sketched scenes from memory. Skeletal men huddled under scraps of cloth, bodies piled beside the deadline, guards watching from above with rifles poised. One drawing showed a prisoner attempting to eat a piece of leather torn from his boot, while another depicted a burial detail hauling limp bodies to a shallow trench. These images were published in newspapers and magazines across the North, and they horrified readers. Words alone could not convey the depth of the suffering, but the drawings made it impossible to look away. Public reaction was swift and furious. Northern newspapers ran exposés with headlines that shouted of rebel barbarity and the hell of Andersonville. Editorials demanded justice, not just for those who had died, but for the thousands who had been deliberately starved and neglected. Families who had clung to hope for missing sons and brothers learned the truth of their fate, and grief gave way to outrage. Politicians in Washington, some of whom had underestimated the extent of the suffering, now faced a public, demanding accountability. The testimonies also revealed details that went beyond mere neglect. Prisoners spoke of being shot for stepping too close to the deadline, of being beaten by guards for scraps of food, of watching comrades murdered by fellow inmates in the chaos of desperation. They described a world where morality had collapsed under the weight of hunger and hopelessness. "We ceased to think like men," one survivor wrote. "We became creatures that lived only to see the next sunrise." Perhaps most haunting of all were the stories of those who had survived only to die after their release. Many prisoners were too far gone to recover, their bodies unable to process even small amounts of food. They succumbed in Union hospitals, sometimes within days of their liberation. Their deaths, documented in hospital records and family letters, underscored the cruelty of a system that had pushed human beings beyond the limits of endurance. By the time congressional hearings were convened to investigate the conditions at Andersonville, the name itself had already become synonymous with horror. It was spoken with the same dread once reserved for battlefields like Antietam or Shiloh, but the fear it evoked was different. Those had been places of combat, where men fought and died as soldiers. Andersonville was something darker, a place where men died as prisoners, stripped of their dignity, forgotten by the world beyond the walls. The testimonies left a mark not just on the public conscience, but on the nation's memory. They became part of the larger story of the Civil War, a grim reminder that suffering did not end when the shooting stopped. In towns and cities across the North, memorials were built and speeches were given, not just to honor the dead, but to warn future generations of the depths to which humanity could sink. Andersonville was no longer just a place in Georgia. It was a symbol of neglect, cruelty, and the enduring power of those who survived to bear witness. When the guns of the Civil War finally fell silent and the Confederacy collapsed, there was a deep hunger in the North, not only for peace, but for accountability. Hundreds of thousands of men had died, and an entire nation had been torn apart. Yet amid all the carnage, certain atrocities stood apart, and none loomed larger in the public mind than Andersonville. The name itself had become a byword for cruelty and suffering, a symbol of human misery so profound that it seemed to demand retribution. And at the center of that storm stood one man, Heinrich Hartmann Wirz, the Swiss-born captain who had served as the prison's commandant. Wirz had not built Andersonville, nor had he designed its policies, but to many he embodied everything that was monstrous about the place. It was he who enforced the deadline with ruthless precision. It was he who signed off on ration distributions that barely sustained life. It was he whose orders left sick men to die in the mud without medicine or shelter. When Union troops liberated the camp and saw the skeletal survivors crawling from the stockade, their fury needed a focus, and Wirz became it. He was arrested in May 1865, only weeks after the war ended, and taken to Washington, D.C. in chains. His trial, held by a military commission that summer and autumn, was one of the first war crimes tribunals in American history. It was also one of the most sensational spectacles of the post-war era. Newspapers covered every detail, and crowds gathered daily outside the courtroom to hear the latest testimony. Survivors of Andersonville took the stand, their voices trembling as they described the starvation, the shootings, the rampant disease. They told of pleading for food and water, of watching comrades beaten or shot for crossing invisible lines, of men so broken by neglect they died whispering for mercy that never came. Some wept as they spoke, others shook with rage. The prosecution argued that Wirz bore direct responsibility for the suffering and death of more than 13,000 Union soldiers. They painted him as a man who had not merely followed orders, but had gone out of his way to enforce cruelty, a tyrant who wielded his authority without compassion or restraint. Witnesses claimed he had personally ordered punishments, refused medical care, and even boasted of the death toll. They held up letters and orders signed in his name as evidence of his culpability. Wirz's defense, led by a small team of lawyers, painted a very different picture. They argued that he had been a scapegoat, a low-ranking officer trapped in a collapsing system far beyond his control. The Confederacy itself was starving, they pointed out, and there were no supplies to give. The breakdown of prisoner exchanges, a political decision made in Richmond and Washington, meant that the prison population had ballooned beyond anything it was designed to hold. Wirz, they insisted, was simply following orders, doing what he could under impossible circumstances. Even some Union officers admitted that the larger failures of policy and logistics had played a role in the tragedy. But public opinion was not swayed. Too many had seen the photographs of emaciated survivors. Too many had heard the testimony of men who had endured the horrors of Andersonville. In the eyes of the nation, someone had to answer for it. On October 24, 1865, the military tribunal found Heinrich Hartmann Wirz guilty of war crimes, including murder and violations of the laws of war. The sentence was death by hanging. His execution, carried out on November 10, 1865, drew thousands of spectators. Some cheered as the trapdoor fell, while others watched in grim silence, unsure whether justice had truly been served. Wirz reportedly maintained his innocence to the end, insisting that he had done his duty and no more. His death marked one of the few instances in which a Confederate official was executed for wartime conduct, and it set a precedent for how the United States would confront atrocities in future conflicts. Yet the trial did more than punish a single man. It ignited a fierce debate that still lingers in historical memory. Was Wirtz a monster, or was he a pawn in a larger machinery of cruelty? Did his execution bring justice for the dead, or did it merely satisfy a public thirst for vengeance? To the families of the men who had perished behind Andersonville's walls, the verdict felt like a measure of closure. But to others, it raised uncomfortable questions about responsibility, about the line between obedience and complicity, and about the nature of justice in war. In the decades that followed, historians would revisit Wirtz's case again and again, some portraying him as a villain who showed no mercy, others as a scapegoat, sacrificed to appease a grieving nation. But regardless of how his actions are judged, his name remains forever linked to Andersonville. His trial ensured that the horrors of that place would not fade quietly into history. They would be remembered, not just as a tragedy, but as a warning. Long after the smoke of the Civil War cleared and the nation began stitching itself back together, Andersonville remained a wound that refused to close. The stockade itself rotted away, its sharpened timbers collapsing back into the earth, but the ground beneath it was forever changed. Beneath that soil lay the remains of more than 13,000 Union soldiers, many of them unknown, buried far from the homes they longed to return to. Their suffering had ended, but their story was far from over. It lived on in the cemetery that rose where the burial trenches once scarred the Georgia clay, a quiet, solemn field where the dead spoke without words and the living came to listen. In the years immediately following the war, the U.S. government moved quickly to give the fallen of Andersonville the dignity they had been denied in life. Burial parties returned to the site, locating the scattered graves that had been hastily dug by fellow prisoners. Records kept by men inside the camp, including the work of Dorrance Atwater, a former inmate who had secretly copied burial lists at great personal risk, allowed many of the dead to be identified and reinterred properly, where once rough, wooden markers with names scratched by pocket knives had stood. White marble headstones now rose in neat, endless rows. Each stone bore a name, a regiment, and a state where possible. Many, however, were marked simply as unknown, a stark reminder of how thoroughly the war had erased individual lives. Visitors to Andersonville in the decades after the war often described the experience as haunting. The cemetery seemed to stretch on forever, row after row of small white markers glowing under the Georgia sun. At its center, a tall obelisk rose, dedicated to the memory of all who had perished there. Veterans and families traveled from across the country to walk among the graves, to kneel beside the names of fathers, brothers, and sons who had never come home. Some wept openly. Others stood in silence, tracing letters carved into stone, their hands lingering as if touching the dead themselves. Even those who had no personal connection to the place found it impossible to remain unmoved. The sheer scale of the cemetery, thousands upon thousands of graves, stretching farther than the eye could see, conveyed a sense of loss no speech could capture. Over time, Andersonville National Cemetery became more than a burial ground. It became a symbol of suffering, of endurance, and of the consequences of forgetting our shared humanity. School children visited on field trips, their teachers recounting stories of starvation, disease, and neglect. Veterans' organizations held ceremonies there, reading aloud the names of the dead. On Memorial Day, the rows of headstones were decorated with small American flags, each one a tribute to a life cut short. The wind that moved through the cemetery carried not just the rustle of leaves, but the echoes of voices from the past, the whispered prayers of the dying and the silent testimony of those who had endured. Yet Andersonville's memory also served as a warning. The site was not only a place to mourn, but a place to confront uncomfortable truths about what happens when the rules of war break down, when human beings are stripped of dignity and reduced to statistics, when hatred and indifference outweigh compassion. Politicians and generals spoke there of the lessons the war had taught, of the need for humane treatment of prisoners, and the obligations that nations bear even in times of conflict. Historians wrote of Andersonville not simply as a tragedy, but as a case study in the dangers of unchecked power and the ease with which cruelty can become routine. The passage of time has not dulled Andersonville's significance. More than a century and a half after the last prisoner died there, the cemetery still draws visitors, descendants searching for ancestors, historians piecing together stories, and ordinary people seeking to understand the weight of the past. The white headstones stand as they always have, silent and unyielding, each one a monument to a life that ended too soon and a story that must not be forgotten. The story of Andersonville is not just about war or death. It is about the human capacity for suffering, endurance, cruelty, and compassion. It is about the men who endured unimaginable conditions and those who did not survive them. It is about the cost of indifference and the power of memory to keep the past alive so that its lessons are never lost. In the stillness of the cemetery, where rows of marble stretch across the Georgia soil, the dead of Andersonville continue to speak, reminding each new generation of what happens when humanity is stripped from war and of the responsibility the living bear to ensure it never happens again.